Good evening, and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I am Diane Sayre, and today is Friday, February 9th, and we are in an extremely dramatic situation. As people know, I am again taking a 3-week perspective on certain aspects of American history, as we did during the 3 weeks leading into Christmas, and took up the American Revolution and Washington's Crossing. We are taking leading up to my February 18th President's Day conference, for which I hope everyone listening is registered either to watch on Zoom or come into Manhattan and participate in person. We are taking up for 3 weeks the question of the U.S. presidency. We had last week an excellent presentation from my campaign historian, Bob Wesser, on President Grant and the global mission of the United States. We have tonight Suzanne Klebe on Smedley Butler and also the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt as related to Smedley Butler's fortunate actions. And then next week will be Abraham Lincoln and Shakespeare. Now, speaking of President's Day, wanted to present a contrast. You could call it a study in presidents. And as people are aware, we just had Tucker Carlson visiting with Vladimir Putin in Russia, conducting an interview, the first interview with a Western journalist, I believe, since Russia began its special military operation. There's a lot more that could be said. I just chose a short clip here because you can think of this, and I'll show you a clip from a press conference given by our president, Joe Biden, a little later, but let's watch this for just a minute.
One of our senior United States senators from the state of New York, Chuck Schumer, said yesterday, I believe, that we have to continue to fund the Ukrainian effort, or U.S. soldiers, citizens could wind up fighting there. How do you assess that?
This is a provocation, and a cheap provocation at that. I do not understand why American soldiers should fight in Ukraine. There are mercenaries from the United States there. The bigger number of mercenaries comes from Poland, with mercenaries from the United States in second place and mercenaries from Georgia in third place. Well, if somebody has the desire to send regular troops, that would certainly bring humanity to the brink of very serious global conflict. This is obvious. Do the United States need this? What for? Thousands of miles away from your national territory. Don't you have anything better to do? You have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with the national debt, more than $33 trillion. You have nothing better to do, so you should fight in Ukraine? Wouldn't it be better to negotiate with Russia, make an agreement, already understanding the situation that is developing today, realizing that Russia will fight for its interests to the end? And realizing this, actually return to common sense, start respecting our country and its interests, and look for certain solutions. It seems to me that this is much smarter and more rational.
Who blew up Nord Stream?
You for sure.
I was busy that day. Nate, do you have I did not blow up Nord Stream. Thank you, though.
Okay, so just on that, a president who is healthy, robust, has color in his cheeks and a good sense of humor, and also rational, which may be why Russia, in spite of, or perhaps because of, the record number of sanctions imposed by the United States and the West on that country, has now become the most productive and prosperous economy in Europe. Now, let's hear a little bit about President Joe Biden, who is reeling from the special prosecutor investigating his sloppy handling of classified documents, that he is a well-meaning elderly gentleman who seems to have some memory issues. And I don't know if the Democratic Party is going to be insane enough to continue to promote him as president, or if they're going to come up with some other dreadful option. But just take a look at this in contrast.
You know that the conduct of the response in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, has been over the top. I think that, as you know, initially, the president of Mexico, Sisi, did not want to open up the gate to allow humanitarian material to get in. I talked to him. I convinced him to open the gate. I talked to Bibi to open the gate on the Israeli side. I've been pushing really hard to get humanitarian assistance.
Okay, President El-Sisi of Mexico, no doubt it was Mexico where the kibbutz was located that Joe Biden's family were in when the attack occurred 65 years ago. That's the president of the United States, a major nuclear superpower. Obviously, we're in deep trouble. And he claims he's been pushing Israel hard, but we have the example of President Reagan, who actually made a phone call to Menachem Begin when he was bombing southern Lebanon, and within 20 minutes, the bombing was stopped. We know that a single phone call from Biden threatening that Israel would not be our friend anymore would put a stop to the unbelievable slaughter which is going on now in Gaza, where between dead, which is close to or over 30,000, and wounded, which is approaching 70,000, and missing, which is about 10,000, you have now over 100,000 Palestinians, primarily women and children, dead, wounded, and missing. And now Netanyahu is saying he wants to bomb Rafah. This is the area where 1.9 million homeless Palestinian refugees have been shoved. They're saying the population density there could be as high as 22,000 people per square kilometer. And they have, since the ruling by the International Court of Justice, decided to drastically cut funds to the UN Relief Works Agency because, on Israel's say-so, 9 people out of 13,000 were somehow involved in the October 7th Hamas terror attack on Israel, so that you're going to have famine and disease. You already have it, but it's going to drastically worsen. And the world sits by, and now you have the International Court of Justice saying that there is plausibly genocide going on, having ordered Israel to submit a report as to how they are acting to prevent genocide. South Africa is escalating. There will be more hearings on the 19th. Also, the rotation of the judges has come up. So the new judge is from Lebanon, not an American. Perhaps the court will come up with something much stronger, but that hearing is not until February 19th. How many hundreds or thousands of Palestinian people are going to die between now and then? And by the standards at Nuremberg, knew or should have known, every member of the U.S. Congress is complicit in this, unless they are among the so far minority, significant and growing minority, who have called for a ceasefire, who are fighting to stop this. And of course, we have the wall of shame of those 200 plus representatives, of whom there are 14 in New York, who are saying that the South African case has no merit. And as far as I know, not one of them has yet taken their name off of that. And in the midst of this, I'm also happy to announce that Jose Vega, who is running the AV here, is going to take on one of the congressmen who represents AIPAC in the Bronx, Richie Torres. So our strength and our slate in New York is growing. But let me stop there and turn it over to Suzanne Klebe, who is going to be telling us a few things about Smedley Butler. So welcome, Suzanne, and go ahead and don't forget to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay. Well, I wanted to start off just to give you a sense of Smedley Butler by listening to Smedley Butler. So we have two very short clips, and just to introduce them, Smedley Butler, General Smedley Butler, is the person who wrote the very famous book, War is a Racket. And I think what we're in now and what we've been in for a very, very long time indicates how accurate that is. But his statement on this is a little bit different than you might think, because he was one of the most highly decorated Marines in American history. He fought in many wars. He fought in wars which he later realized should never have happened. So his analysis, which is really accurate, I was very interested even in what Putin just said about why are you sending your troops way over here when you have things closer to home. I mean, there's a whole series of things which Smedley Butler talked about, but what I want to do is to start off with two videos. One has to do with something he did in 1934, which is that he exposed a plot for a coup, a fascist coup in the United States against Roosevelt, 1934. He testified to Congress. He identified the people from Wall Street, the major financial interests who were involved in a coup at that time. As wild as it may sound, and at the time there were attacks, it was later shown to be absolutely accurate. So I want to show you a short clip on that. And then the other clip, which is also short, is an address he made at the Bonus March. There was a march of veterans. Let's see, this was when Hoover was still in. They were trying to it was a depression. They were impoverished. They were veterans of World War I. They were going to get their bonuses, but not until, I think, 1945. So they wanted them early. So they had a huge camp out in Washington, D.C. on the grounds. And Smedley Butler addressed them, which had a very big impact on the election of FDR. So I guess we'll just start by showing those two clips, if Jose, you can do that. Here's the clip on the plot that he exposed against FDR.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff, or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government. I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena on Sunday, November 18th. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations. As it then seemed to me to be getting serious, I felt it was my duty to tell all I knew of such activities to this committee. My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institution. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write. If we maintain these basic principles, our democracy is safe. No dictatorship can exist with suffrage, freedom of speech, and press. Makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. Let me tell you something. I've been all over the world. I've seen you fellas on the streets in Washington. There isn't this well-behaved group of citizens in the world that's sitting right in this camp. Take it from me. This is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had. Pure Americanism. Willing to take this beating as you've taken it. Stand right steady. You keep every law. And why in the hell shouldn't you? Who in the hell has done all the bleeding for this country and for this law and this Constitution anyhow but you fellas?
So that was Butler addressing the bonus march. And you may know the bonus march was broken up by Hoover. They gassed it. They burned the houses of the huts that people had built up in the Anacostia area of DC, where the bonus march was based. And some of the people involved in breaking it up and gassing the veterans were Douglas MacArthur, Patton was there, and so forth. It was a real shock. And you can imagine it was a shock to people like Butler, who had been involved so long in the military. It also had a lot, it played into the defeat of Hoover. And Roosevelt had a totally different perspective. He said that people should have just been asked to go home. And later, when they again came and asked for their bonuses, he arranged to have them get jobs in the CCC and made deals. But the idea of Butler was that he was totally committed to the military and to the troops in the military, but he also was honest. And it's very important to consider what we're dealing with now around these wars and the manipulation of the wars, the financial speculation of the wars, and also the whole question of why the U.S. is acting like an empire rather than what we're designed to do, which was to be a beacon of hope and a temple of liberty and something that could give an example to the world rather than going around the world overthrowing governments and acting in the most vicious way like the British Empire or like we see going on right now in Gaza. So I want to start with some slides, which I'm going to go through fairly quickly, I hope. And here's the first one is to just consider what we have here when it comes to the idea of war being a racket. So the first slide, which I don't think you can see yet because we're figuring out how to screen share it here. The first one is what happened in Iraq. The $12 billion of cash that was sent to Iraq. You might remember this. I don't know if you can see these slides we have. Oh, can you see this? Is this on the screen?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so we're just going to go through these. But, you know, the last number of years, these wars have cost us trillions of dollars. And as we know, and as we'll hear Butler talked about later in 1935, when he wrote War is a Racket, it tends to be the same game. It's huge amounts of money. It buys material, some of which is used, some of which isn't used. And in this case, these are just some of the things that were scandals in the wars that began to occur after 9/11, which really, you know, should have shut down a certain amount of this kind of corruption. But, you know, there's been no effect really whatsoever. So this is Iraq. Let me just see now. How do I? Oh, okay. So, and here's the results of Brown University study, which said that and this was 2021, and now we're 2 years beyond it, that the amount of the 20-year war on terror, $8 trillion and 900,000 dead, 900,000. And that doesn't count, I mean, the millions of people who died in Iraq, in Libya among civilians, and the effect of the wars that are continuing. And here's Smedley Butler's take on it, War is a Racket. And he wrote this in 1935. The two clips we showed you, 34 was when he was showing that there was a planned coup against the FDR administration. Remember, FDR had been ripping into Wall Street. Ferdinand Pecora had his investigation of the bankruptcy of Wall Street before FDR even came in. And that is all referenced in FDR's inaugural address. In 36, FDR gave a famous speech at Madison Square Garden where he said of these economic royalists, as he called them, he said, they hate me and I welcome their hatred. And he talked about the fact that they thought that the government was simply their instrument and it had nothing whatsoever to do with the people. So those, were all around this period that Butler was touring the country, giving anti-war speeches every place, as well as promoting FDR's election. But the focus was on the fact that the wars were devastating, not only to the country, but absolutely devastating to the troops. So here's Butler. The picture up in the corner is Butler as a young man. He joined the military when he was 16 years old. He was 2 years underage. He had to sneak in. He was a Quaker, and his mother, who was a Quaker, was the one who brought him to Washington and got him in, even though he was 2 years underage. His father was a congressman. He was born in Pennsylvania. He was later awarded 2 Congressional Medals of Honor. The contents here are the contents of his book, War Is A Racket. Chapter 1, War Is A Racket. 2, Who Makes the Profits. 3, Who Pays the Bills. 4, How to Smash This Racket. And 5, To Hell with War. So that's his book, and here he is at the age of 16 sneaking in. And why is he going? He's going to the war first in Cuba because the media, the yellow press as they called it, was basically pounding away at the brutality of the Spanish Empire against the people in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, and so forth. And the reports were so horrific that when Butler went to war and his mother signed him up, it was a humanitarian idea. They wanted to go help save the people of Cuba. This should remind you of something in the current wars and the propaganda that gets us into them, which is always about trying to save somebody rather than the forces that are actually at work. So here's the famous headline: when the Maine was sunk, Roosevelt, who was the assistant secretary, this is before he leaves to go become a Rough Rider himself. But these are the headlines, and this is the kind of pictures and the horror stories that were being told to people that would get them to want to do whatever they could to save the people there. Meanwhile, here's Teddy Roosevelt walking through all over the Caribbean on the question of going into Cuba. Now, Roosevelt was, as this book, The War Lovers, goes into, was absolutely committed to war for its own sake. He many times would say it really didn't matter where the war was as long as it was war. It's important to remember that this is the same period that the British are involved in wars in the Boer War. Africa is being divided among the European countries. I have a list, I was going to show it, of all the wars the British had been involved in during the 19th century. And it's constant. This is the mentality around people like Teddy Roosevelt. At the end of this, if I get to the slides, his uncle, Teddy Roosevelt's uncle, was a Maine intelligence agent for the Confederacy. He played a critical role in getting the ships from the British side that were involved in attacking the North during the Civil War. But Teddy Roosevelt, just to give you a sense of that, he actually wrote a letter right after he got into the presidency in which he brags about this. And he says that not only is he proud of his uncle, who he was very close to, who of course had moved to London, had moved to Britain after the Civil War, but he also pointed out that one half of the troops in Cuba with him as a Rough Rider were children, or were actually soldiers from the Confederacy. There was a push made at the time that if you could unite the Union soldiers with the Confederate soldiers, this would be a way to reunify the country. And the way to do that was to get into these wars. So they moved immediately into these countries. Now, there were already movements in the different countries that were part of the Spanish Empire, which was beginning to fracture, that themselves had been involved in revolutionary activity to try to establish independent countries, independent of Spain. These were already existing. And in the case of Cuba, the U.S. offered to help them, that we were going to help them win their fight against Spain. We did a similar thing in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, when they achieved their independence, not only the minute their independence was achieved, it turned out that the Spanish government had already sold them to the United States and their independence was gone. This is a letter, a famous letter by Jose Marti, who was one of the revolutionaries in Cuba, where he actually warned people who were considering making this arrangement with the United States, which they had actually believed was going to support the independence of these countries. I mean, this was the American system. This is what was said. And Marty's letter, which is very famous, he basically says, don't be a sucker. Don't go for this. And this is, very, very famous and quite accurate because, it didn't work out. Now, here again, another war that Smedley Butler was involved in was against in what happened with the Boxer Rebellion in China. There's a long background to why the Boxers were rebelling and who they were and the relationship to the Chinese government. But I won't go through all that now, just to say that this was a major deployment. It was very bloody. It was a real, operation to get through this war. But again, you can see that it was pushed by McKinley at the time as a way to save the people. The media was saying that there were Westerners there. They were missionaries, and they were running different kinds of small businesses or, certain kinds of things outside of the Forbidden City in Peking and throughout China. And the media was saying that they were all being killed. They had stories of women being crucified and so forth. So, of course, you had a reaction, and there was a coalition of countries that went in to China to supposedly they thought they were going to liberate the people who were being tortured in the area. And Smedley Butler was one of them, who went in as a Marine. I won't go through all the details of it, but these wars were continuing one after the other, and he was involved. Now, if you look at this map just shows the interventions that the U.S. was involved in, and that Smedley Butler was involved in Cuba, in Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, in Nicaragua, Panama, and in Mexico. He was involved in all of these. And they were very, he was awarded because he was a pretty wild guy in many ways. I mean, in Nicaragua, for instance, I just have a quote here just to give you a sense of, why he was looked upon the way that he was. He was absolutely fearless. So, and he was young. I mean, he was 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, and as these things were developing. So they had this one story where, again, you have the already existing revolutionaries in the area. They're trying to get their freedom out from the control of the Spanish Empire. The Americans come in to supposedly help, and it doesn't quite work out that way. But in this one, I'm just going to read you this one sentence to give you a sense of, of Butler. So they're on the railroad tracks, and the rebels are there stopping the train. And they're saying, we will not, if the train moves, the rebel leader says, he yanks the gun from his belt, sticks it in Butler's gut. If the train moves, he told Butler, I shoot. And then it says, and this is from Butler's memoirs, the world stopped. Butler could not hear a sound, but he could see everything around him with the clarity of a hawk. Quote, 100 red-blooded Americans were clustered around the locomotive to see what I would do. End quote. If he backed down, he would humiliate his beloved Marine Corps. Quote, if I signaled to the Marines to shoot, there would be a frightful slaughter. In a flash, Butler made a grab for the rebel's gun, snatching it from the shocked man's grip. Then, for a theatrical flourish, the Marine emptied the cartridges into the ground. There was stunned silence. And suddenly, Hundreds of men, Nicaraguans and Americans, all burst into wild laughter. The death spell had been broken. He was wild. He would do things like this. They were coming down from the mountains after this was over, and the brakes went out in the train, so they didn't know what to do. So he just told them to gun it, and they barreled down, hurtling forward. It said by now it was dark and steady drizzle was falling. The lights on the engine were out. The only illumination came from a feeble lantern held aloft by a young sergeant. As the train picked up speed, rocketing towards its gloomy unknown, the sergeant frantically waved his lantern in search of cows or boulders on the track. The sailors and Marines, most of whom were packed into a boxcar in the rear, stared with wide-eyed terror into the pitch black void. Quote, "Look out," they yelled in unison as their bullet train tilted madly into the curves. So by the time they hit Managua, the train was soaring so fast it flew right past the government's army outposts. Settled sentries blazed fire at the speeding target, not knowing it was friend or foe. Fortunately, their aim was so haphazard, none of the bullets hit. And the American ambassador and a boisterous crowd were gathered at the railroad station to greet Butler and his troops, but the train raced by them, stopping only when it struck an upgrade, after which it drifted slowly backwards to the waiting, dumbfounded delegation. So I read that, like he was wild, and he was in the middle of all these battles. The question is, of course, what were we doing there, and why was the U.S. involved in overthrowing governments that hadn't even become governments yet? And this is what Butler later said when he retired, which he was forced to retire. He was actually, as I'll show, they actually tried to court-martial him at one point for attacking Mussolini. But he said this, if I can see at the top. Oh, I can't see it now. It's okay. So he basically went through at the top. He said, what was I doing this whole time? I was doing this wild stuff. I was brave. I got these medals. A lot of people died. A lot of people suffered. He said, and I realized what I was doing is I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. He said I was basically being used by the financial interests. This is what I was doing. He said I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues. I helped raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. In China, I helped to see to it that Standard Oil went in its way unmolested. Now, this is his statement, and I looked up each of these cases, and I have slides on them, but it'll take too long to show. But it's every single case, is exactly what they were actually doing. And you'll see on a couple of them, okay, if I can get this next slide to go. Okay. Here's a map to just show. This is Tampico over here. That's where the oil interests were. American sailors were arrested, and then the Marines came in. They occupied Veracruz. You can see from the map that there were already revolutionary activities going on in Mexico. So you had the U.S. intervening in situations that were already. You had Zapata, Pancho Villa. You had a lot going on, and we were in the middle of it. Usually and quite often on some pretext, which became very bloody. Here they are putting up the flag over Veracruz, that's in Mexico, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua. The U.S. occupied the Dominican Republic in 1916. You can see the Marines there. In Haiti, the Haiti situation was particularly brutal. This is an article by James Weldon Johnson, which people might know. He's the famous musician who wrote what's known as the Lift All Our Hearts and Sing. It's a famous civil rights song.
Lift every voice and sing.
Okay, lift every voice and sing. So you may not know he was involved in these investigations, but he was sent by the NAACP to Haiti to find out what was going on there and why the troops were there. And he wrote this report, which is really devastating, called Self-Determining Haiti. He said, to know the reasons for the present political situation in Haiti, to understand why the United States landed and has for 5 years maintained military forces in that country, why some 3,000 Haitian men, women, and children have been shot down by American rifles and machine guns. It is necessary, among other things, to know that the National City Bank in New York is very much interested in Haiti. And then he goes on from there in a similar reference that Smedley Butler had made about the role of Wall Street in these wars, but you also get a sense of the brutality of the wars. And here are pictures that, that Weldon Johnson published showing, the brutality against, the people of Haiti, including, again, there was a revolution going on, and it was a question of saying that they were actually targeting people like animals in the area. This is the kind of thing that was going on, and I reference it because if you look at what we've done in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, what's going on right now in the Middle East, we have to change this conception. This idea of becoming an empire and allowing ourselves to break our own constitutional or at least political dedication to the idea of the general welfare internationally, this always leads to disaster. Here you have the deployment of Smedley Butler in World War I, but this comes before that. This is the invasion of the Philippines. Again, this was, you can see Puck, the British press showing the U.S. smashing the head of the Philippines, again, revolutionary leadership. Mark Twain and a group of Americans were horrified by these things. And there was a movement called the anti-imperialists, and they also, identified themselves as against annexation, against a movement that was turning the U.S. into something that it wasn't. This book, Mark Twain and the Colonel, Twain was one of the more prominent people in this. And Twain writes a lot about the brutality, particularly of the operation in the Philippines. This is a cartoon, which I'll show you what's in it, Mark Twain and the Stain of Torture. One of the things that was going on, you see imperial measures, administrating is in the administration, repeal of the Declaration of Independence, perversion of the Monroe Doctrine, military despotism, violation of the rule of law, government by injunction, autocracy, aristocracy, plutocracy, feudalism. This is what they, was clear to them, and they said this is expansion. They also show the guy who's down here, on the ground, he is being given the water torture. So what we did during the Iraq War was done then, and it was horrific. Some of the quotes from the soldiers who were there were that they had to leave. They couldn't stand to see the sight of what was happening. But you can see it's the water torture, exactly. They're using the spigot, they're pumping water into the person until his belly
That's
explodes.
Uncle Sam.
That's
Uncle Sam on the ground.
Exactly. And they would then jump on the person to get the water out, and then they do it again. I have some numbers about the number of people who died just from the torture. This was we were doing this. That's all you can say. And you can see the cartoons of people saying, this is horrific. I blew this part up, and you can see what they're saying is being destroyed. American ideals, Sumner's teachings, Adams, Washington's address. It wasn't that there wasn't a realization that what was going on was absolutely wrong. This is a cartoon, again, in Puck. And what it shows is what they call the idol of the aunties. The idol is the leader of the Philippine revolution, and all the people around it, they call them aunties because these were attacks on the people against turning the U.S. into an empire. And they said they were like, aunties, they were like, crying women. And they're all, if you look at close to who they are, there's Pulitzer is one of them, there's a whole group of prominent artists and others who were there, being ridiculed because they didn't want to have the U.S. involved in such horrors. This cartoon was the leader again of the Philippines Revolution. And you can see, I mean, it's a real racist depiction. The racism was just massive in this whole thing. It was huge everywhere. At the time, there was this big push around eugenics to supposedly show the scientific basis of race and racism and so forth. But throughout this whole period, there was such a perversion of U.S. principles that even one of the things Bob quoted last week about saying, I think it was Adams, talking about how we're going to spread American ideas all over the world. This was turned on its head to say we're going to spread American ideas because they're superior to these barbarians, and it's on the basis of this that we have the right to assert this control. Now, this was the election in 1900, and there was a fight over whether or not this empire and expansion should continue. And surprisingly, it was the Democrats who were opposing it. You can see here, there's a quote from Bryan, who was the presidential election candidate for the Democrats. He said, when you go to the polls to vote, remember, you are an American citizen. For 124 years, this notion has held before the world the light of liberty. Don't let this light be extinguished in the jungles of the Philippines. Bryan implored his fellow citizens. In the end, the American people chose the dazzling vision of global power pointed to by FDR, and he lost the election by a landslide. And the continued expansion of empire went on. Here was the illegal overthrow of the government of Hawaii. Of course, if you look at the Philippines, I don't have the map here, but Hawaii was considered just.
You mean Teddy Roosevelt, not FDR?
Yes. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Very important difference. But this is a letter written by the last queen of Hawaii saying she had no choice but to cede certain control because they were being threatened militarily with all being killed, but that they had to be given their rights back again as a sovereign country. So this continued, and the move into World War I, was part of this dynamic. Although there was, of course, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, an even more brutal shift where it was there was a move to say that anybody who attacked any of the countries involved as an ally in World War I would then be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And as we went through, there's a filmmaker in particular who was given a long sentence for doing a film on the American Revolution because it showed the brutality of the British. This was no longer allowed. You had to go along with this. The war itself was again pushed in the similar way the other ones were, that there was some terrible thing that happened to women and children. In this case, the sinking of the Lusitania. You see the poster saying enlist, and a woman is drowning, but still holding her baby. And this is the kind of thing that was done to get people into the wars. But as Butler said, the wars were horrific. And he said in one place, he was in awe of what this strange war was doing to men. And, many people died, the troops, even when they first came in, of disease. I mean, there was an extremely high number of people that died, just of the pandemic at the time coming over in the boats. But you see these guys with their gas masks. And Butler mentions this in War Is A Racket. He said, we're going into a period of warfare, which is more horrific than anything we've seen before. And he talked about his estimate that gas and chemical warfare would be the next form of warfare used. This was 1935. He said he didn't know exactly what the horrors would be, but that we had to deal with science creating such new weapons. And then he says in War Is A Racket, the way he ends it is he said the only way to deal with this is to end the production of weapons altogether and use the talents of the people doing that for better areas of production, which of course is similar to what we're talking about with the shift from swords to plowshares. But these are the Marines were everywhere as an arm of this operation. And Butler, was a big part of it. So for him to then come out as a major spokesman against war was really a big deal. He was he was asked at one point to take a break from the military and head up the police in Philadelphia to go after organized crime, which he did so effectively that they fired him within a year because he said, you have to go after the big guys. Why are we going after the little guys? Let's go after the people actually running this. He continued to get himself into big trouble. On the left is a cartoon, but it's about a story that he told because he had heard it in a speech about Mussolini being with an American journalist and running over a child. And the journalist said, you just killed that little girl. And Mussolini said, so what? No big deal. So Smedley Butler reported this in a speech, and for this, he was in the process of being court-martialed. Everything else, forget it. This was this because, of course, at the time, Mussolini was being heavily promoted, including by people who later, Thomas Lamont, in a case in point, who was a big promoter of Mussolini, was part of this group that Smedley Butler showed was involved in this attempted coup against FDR. The next slide shows the headlines. First, they wanted him to apologize. He was going to be court-martialed for the slur. He would not apologize. He got arrested. The Italian press called the speech impudent. And then he stuck to his guns. And of course, the journalist stepped forward and it was all shown he was absolutely right. That's what was said. And everything was dropped. But, obviously this was a big deal. So he resigned from the military. And then he began speaking all over the country on the question of war, and that it's a racket, that he saw things. He saw, for instance, with the Boxer Rebellion, when they were all sent there from all these different countries, and it was really brutal, and they were, doing all sorts of things during the war. And then when they got there to save the people, they found the people were just there, having tea. I mean, it wasn't what they were told. There was something else going on, obviously. So here we are at the part we showed at the beginning with him addressing the bonus marchers. A ragged army of veterans set up camp in Washington with their families. This is during the Depression. Here they are again. And Butler intervenes and gives this speech, and they're burned out, and so forth. We showed that video already of him addressing the bonus marchers. But here you have, Butler then began to be to campaign for FDR. Now, he was not only doing it for there were several things. One is he ran for the Senate himself, and his economic program was to deal with the poverty during the Depression in different kinds of public health help projects. There was a whole series of things. So he oriented in that direction. Also, Hoover, who was the one responsible for the bonus march, destroying these people, he had a particular antipathy for. Hoover also was in China during the Boxer Rebellion, and it was said that he hid when the other people were involved in the war, but that he had also misdirected people, and a lot of people died. So Hoover obviously had no love for Smedley Butler, and Butler was campaigning for FDR. And then you get into this, that because of his role with the military and how highly he was regarded as a soldier, that he would work with these guys, sleep with them, eat with them, and, the bonus march, he was approached by a group of Wall Street guys asking him to lead an armed takeover with 500,000 veterans were supposed to be part of this to overthrow the government. And Butler, he basically went along with these guys. He got their names, he got the connections, he figured out what was happening, and then he went public. And then we showed the clip at the beginning of his speech. So, this is who the guy was. And what I want to do is just quickly go through the book. Now, this is just the letter I referenced at the beginning. Let me see. Oh, this is Teddy Roosevelt. Again, is a whole other story about what Roosevelt represented and the role of the Confederacy in the British connections to this idea of expanding the U.S. into empire. It's a different, another side of it, but it's of real interest. So this is a letter that Roosevelt wrote, talking about how proud he was of his connections. This was the book that Roosevelt encouraged his uncle to write in London about his role in the Secret Service of the Confederacy, and particularly what he did in the Navy. But what I want to do now is just very quickly go through what he says in the book, and I'll try to do this, fast, because it's very much along the lines. Again, if you look at the first thing I showed, those slides about the ripoff of the U.S. economy. So let me do this. War is a racket, he starts. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group knows what it's about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. Then what he does is he documents that. World War I, now there was something called the Nye Commission, which went after what had happened in World War I and the financing. But he said they absolutely did not go far enough. He said at least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the U.S. during the World War. They admitted their blood gains in their tax returns. How many tax returns were falsified, you don't say. He said, but how many millions shouldered a rifle? How many of them dug a trench? How many of them knew what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout? He goes through, ducking shells, shrapnel, a bayonet thrust of an enemy. How many of them were wounded or killed? Out of war, nations acquire additional territory if they are victorious. They just take it. This newly acquired territory promptly is exploited by the few, the self-same few who wrung dollars out of blood in the war. The general public shoulders the bill. And what is this bill? And then he says the bill is mangled bodies, shattered minds, broken hearts, depression, and so forth. He said, for a great many years as a soldier, I had a suspicion that war was a racket. Not until I retired to civil life did I fully realize it. Now that I see the international war clouds gathering as they are today, I must face it and speak out. So he goes through this. He said there's now 40 million men under arms in the world today, but they say, there's no danger of war. He said, what are they doing? And then he goes into the next section of the book, Who Profits? So he said that in 1898, that we didn't own a bit of territory outside the mainland of North America. Our national debt was a little more than $1 billion. At the end of the war period, as a direct result of being involved, the debt jumped to 25 billion. He said the cost of operation is also shifted to the people. His point is that on paper they don't make this much, except what is made goes to a handful of people. Then he names who they are. He goes through the DuPonts. He showed that their companies increased their profits by 950% during World War I, and he goes through the numbers to document that. He then takes the different major corporations, Bethlehem Steel, U.S. Steel, Anaconda Copper, Utah Copper, altogether 200% profit. He goes through the numbers. The Utah Copper, the average they were making was $5 million per year. During the 1910-1914 period, it jumped to an average of $21 million, in 4 years, yearly profits for the war period. And he goes on from there, showing 200% profit. Then he says, and not only do you have the profits, but you have the things that are produced that you pay for, but you don't need them anyway. And he goes through ships that sink, wrenches that don't match any regular nuts, material thrown away at the end of the war, but all paid for. we should remember what goes on with Afghanistan and other places where we just dump stuff because it's paid for, and the profits are made. He talks about the ship, more than 3 billion worth. Some of the ships were all right, but 635, what is that? That's 100,000 million. Okay, but a whole section of them were made by wood. They wouldn't float. So he's just documenting this. But then he said, but let's look at the human costs. I mean, they don't talk about that. They just talk about the other costs. And he said that, he talks about this NI commission that investigated the money made during World War I. He said, but they don't go through the losses of those who fight the war, and they don't show how to limit that, because they're talking about how can they limit the profits. So he said, did they limit to a soldier the loss of but one eye or one arm, or limit his wounds to 1 or 2 or 3, or to limit the loss of life? There's nothing in this scheme that says not more than 12% of a regiment shall be wounded in battle, and not more than 7% in a division shall be killed. So, and then, this is the background of the NI Commission, which functioned from 34 to 36. And, they documented an enormous amount of corruption. But he goes on from there. He says, well, who pays these bills? And then he said the soldier pays the biggest part of it. And he talks about he had gone to veterans hospitals at the time, visited 18 of them. And he said he found a total of 50,000 destroyed men. They were the pick of the nation 18 years ago. That they talk about the mortality of veterans 3 times as great as others. But then he also talked about the mental effects. He said, we train people to kill. They're put shoulder to shoulder through mass psychology. They're entirely changed. We use them for a couple of years and train them to think of nothing about except killing or being killed. Then suddenly we discharge them and they're supposed to change. And he said the readjustment without mass psychology, people can't change. I mean, it has this permanent psychological effect. And then he talks about, that they're then hospitalized. In the government hospital in Marion, Indiana, 1,800 of these boys are in pens, 500 of them in a barracks with steel bars and wires all around outside the building and on the porches. They've already been mentally destroyed. These boys don't even look like human beings. Oh, the looks on their faces, physically they're in good shape, but mentally they're not. Then he talks about the other effect on the soldiers. They lose their jobs, they lose their place at home, the physical effects that are always with them, the psychological, hearing the moans and shrieks of the dying. And then he talks about the pay. He shows that they got paid $30 a month, and all this other stuff was taken out of it. Money they had to send home, money they have to pay for insurance. And he said in some cases what they do is they don't want to give them more money, so they invented the approach that Napoleon made, where Napoleon said everybody likes a medal. So they started giving people medals, in response. And he said, we tell them to do this to make the world safe for democracy. No one mentioned to them that they're going and they're dying would be huge war profits. And he goes through the whole effect of the phony patriotism, and you don't pay them anything, and the psychological and long-term effects, the effects on the families of what happens to them. And then, he continues and he said, well, so how do we smash this racket? And then he has 3 points. We must take the profit out of war. We have to permit the youth of the land who would bear arms to decide whether or not there should be a war. We must limit our military forces to home defense purposes. And to take the profit out, he says that everybody working in a military industrial company, or the banks that finance it, or the senators, should all have the same pay. The soldier takes $30 a month with everything taken out of it. Then he says the vote, you should have a plebiscite. Only those who are able to fight and go to war should be able to vote on whether there should be a war. And then, have a special elections to that effect. And then he goes through that the military should be defensive purposes only. The Navy should only be within 200 miles of the coast, planes maybe 500, troops only on U.S. territory. I think of that with what Putin just said about U.S. deployment. And then he says, to hell with war. He said, well, I'm not so naive to think we're not going to have wars. Wilson said he would keep us out of war, and yet 5 months later, he asked Congress to declare war. He didn't tell, there was no vote. 4 million young men put on their uniforms and marched to Sale. What caused the government to change their mind? And he has his ideas of why he thinks that is. But he then concludes, he says, the only way is to disarm without any semblance of practicability, scrap, battleships, artillery. You have to basically say you're not going to produce any of this anymore by agreement. He said, but victory or defeat will be determined by the skill and ingenuity of our scientists. If we put them to work making poison gas and more fiendish mechanical and explosive instruments of destruction, they will have no time for the constructive jobs of building greater prosperity for all peoples. By putting them to this useful job, we can all make more money out of peace than we can out of war, even the munition makers. So I say, to hell with war. So that's War Is a Racket. So that's Smedley Butler. And I think if we consider the situation we're in now, including the kind of brutality that these colonial wars entail, the racist element involved, which I didn't read a lot of the quotes on this, but they're really quite racist, basically. You hear this in Gaza, talking about people being, insects. That was being said in the Philippines. McKinley said he was comparing which country had more problems with mosquitoes, by which he meant people. These things are brutal, and as shown throughout, this is against the American system. It's against what we said we were going to do in our deployment, to not get involved in such wars, and to instead talk about a collaboration with countries for mutual development. Next week, Diana and Robert and so forth will be talking about Lincoln, and Lincoln was the best example of that. He had a profound understanding of it, including the psychology of what it means as a country to continue to do sinful things and think because you're going to get some, or somebody's going to get a short-term gain, that somehow that will benefit you in the future. It will not. We have to overturn the chessboard completely, and we have to reject war altogether. War is a racket, and we have to get back into the idea of serious economic development.
Well, thank you very much. Now, seeing all this and this history of Smedley Butler and the fact that he campaigned for FDR, why would they think he would participate in a coup against FDR? What was the...
Well, why did they think? Well, I don't know why they assumed he would. I mean, they wanted a coup, and they thought he was so close to the military, to the soldiers, and particularly to the bonus marchers, that somehow that they could get out of this desperate people who might go in that direction. But the bonus marchers had no intention of a coup either. They considered themselves Americans. I mean, they thought they could go to their government, and they fought for their government, and they thought they needed the bonus because it was the Depression. So these are arrogant. I mean, I think one of the best ways to think about it is what FDR said about the mentality of these economic royalists, particularly in his 1934 speech, where he gives this whole description of how they think that they are the country, and that everything has to be done on their terms, and they had become
sort of
totally
like BlackRock and Larry Fink today.
Yeah, it's a great speech, that 34 Madison Garden speech. But yeah, I mean, that speech really is I don't have it in front of me here, but it's a very good description of the way FDR's take. And Smedley Butler was also, his family were blue bloods from Philadelphia, and FDR was a blue blood in that sense. And as it was said at the time, they were both, the FDR, they said he was a traitor to his class because he was interested in the well-being of the common man. And I think Smedley Butler had the same orientation, but the the arrogance of these pseudo aristocrats didn't see through that. He lists the names. I mean, DuPont's, Lamont, the governor of Connecticut is a grandson, I think, to Thomas Lamont. A whole group of them that were involved. They were all pro-Mussolini. I mean, they thought this march that Mussolini made, where he seized power, was a good sample. And they were also modeling it on a similar organization that existed in France. There were fascist movements in the United States at the time.
Right.
But they really didn't like FDR or Ferdinand Pecora. Pecora was ripping them apart at the same time.
Yeah, well, we need to do that today, I would say. I mean, that's part of the point of the Swords to Plowshares Act that the LaRouche organization has written up, which I am supporting. And again, I just really want to stress that people come to the conference on February 18th. Everyone who's listening to this should register. If you're anywhere near New York, or even if you're not, you should come in person. It's a Sunday. And if you really absolutely cannot get here, then you can register to sign up on Zoom. I think I put the registration link both on the Facebook comments and in the YouTube comments. But is there anything else, Suzanne, that you want people to consider?
I think that's just that these wars ended up in a world war, and the wars we're in now will go in a similar direction. And it's only possible to shift the paradigm is for the people to not be passive and to actually assert the necessity of reestablishing the ideas of the American Revolution, which we've moved so far away from that people become cynical about it. But they were correct, and they are anti-oligarchical, and they would be critical for peace. And I think what you began with the interview, and also what you're going to, what will happen at the meeting on the 18th with representatives from all over the world. It's kind of like your own State Department meeting with representatives of different countries to sit down and consider how we can jointly establish the conditions for peace and actually respect the idea of the inalienable rights of all people, the right to self-determination, and once and for all live up to the idea that all men are created equal and have the right to be productive. If we finish the American Revolution, which we have not completed yet, it's a very good idea, but there's a lot of work to be done. Then we can have a long-term peace. So that's what I would say.
Well, I agree. So hope everyone watching is in for completing the American Revolution and finishing off the British imperial method, which has lately infected the corridors of power of the United States. So I think with that, we'll wrap up. I hope to see everyone next Friday and then the Sunday after that. And during the week, active during the week. Good night.
Good night.